Hey, welcome again to a conversation about whether or not the Bible has anything to do with our lives. Last week we focused on Hosea, one of the earliest Hebrew preachers that took on the establishment. And it's important to realize then over a period of 800 years until Jesus came on the scene, we had the constant dialogue between the establishment of the Hebrew people that wanted to have a nation, wanted to have a king, and they wanted to have a temple, and the Hebrew preachers which continually warned against some perils of that journey. And last week I sort of termed Hosea's message as the grabbing for power, the power grab, as they aligned themselves with a foreign nation that had nothing to do with Deuteronomy 6:4, which was the law of the Hebrew people in terms of faith. Love your God with all your heart and soul and all your might. And he said, this just doesn't match, and it's the alignment is going to be damaging. Well, this week we will consider how Hosea's message sort of is discovered in the message of Jesus. A lot of biblical scholars point out to us that Jesus didn't teach anything new. Most of the ideas of Jesus were found in the Old Testament preachers, in the history of his people, the Hebrew people. And to some extent that's true and can be verified. But the difference is Jesus not only taught it, he lived it. And so that's what we're going to explore today. Now, again, that history is important. Throughout those 800 years, nationhood had failed. They kept getting beat up by Persia or Babylonia or whatever country. And so nationhood had failed, kingship had failed, their temple had been destroyed. They ended up in Babylonian captivity around the city of Babylon, and where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, several hundred miles from, quote, their promised land. And so it was sort of a failure experience of the establishment, and the Hebrew preachers called that to their attention constantly. They were the annoyers. Now, they were so contaminated that when the Roman Empire came along, the Hebrew people again grabbed for power, tried to align themselves with the Roman Empire, and this was so distasteful that a couple hundred years after that, when the Old Testament books were compiled and decided these 39 books would be in, the other books would be out, one of the boundaries was no book written after the contamination with the Roman Empire could be included in the Old Testament. So we wonder why some Hebrew literature from 175 BC on isn't included in the Old Testament. It's because they felt like they were fully contaminated with their alignment with the Roman Empire, and those books were not true Hebrew literature. So that's the journey, and along came Jesus. The Jesus event took place, and Jesus in his life and in his formation was very familiar with all of the writings, including the Hebrew preachers. And so now we look at Jesus' teachings and see how Hosea's message emerged in Jesus' teaching in the dangerous commitment of alignments that soften or deteriorate faith. Now, quite frankly, I had a bunch of them. I've just selected a very few. But I think that the most influential teaching of Jesus was the teaching of the Great Commandment. And so in a sense, that foundational teaching of Jesus in terms of the Great Commandment picked up where Hosea left off. Remember in the 14th chapter of Hosea, his plea to the Hebrew establishment was based on Deuteronomy 6:4, loving God with all your heart, soul, and might. You know, Jesus added a dimension to that sometimes we forget, and that is that we're to love God with our heart, soul, might, and mind. Jesus added that dimension to the formula that had been with the Hebrew people through all the years. Now, what Jesus was saying in the Great Commandment was, folks, this is all we need. This is all the power we need to follow the Great Commandment, to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and might, and your neighbors yourself. That's it. You don't need any more power. That is the power of love in your life, and that's all the power you need, and you don't need to grab power from any other source but that. And of course, that Great Commandment is found in Matthew 22, and let's just look at that briefly. The Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to the test. Remember the establishment. And they gathered themselves together, and one of them asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, what is the great commandment of the law?" And then Jesus responded with his words that we've already spoken, the great commandment, to love God and your neighbor as yourself. So you see, the first Hebrew prophet, the first Hebrew preacher that we have in the Old Testament literature, where he ended up in chapter 14, is the very center of Jesus' teaching of the Great Commandment. Now, that's just the beginning. Let's go further and say that Hosea continually warned against the definition of a nation as, you know, and the kingship and the importance of the temple. And Jesus taught that a person of faith cannot serve two masters. The nation and faith is not equal. Nation must be informed by faith. Kingship is not what leadership is all about. Persons of faith is what leadership is all about. The temple that had a place for God to reside, no, not at all. Jesus said, we have a faith in God that is expressed in our lives as we love God and as we love our neighbor. And Jesus brought this home in a pretty profound teaching when he talked about you cannot serve two masters. Let's remember what the teaching is, and as Jesus and as recorded in Matthew, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth or rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasury is, there will your heart be also. Indeed, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold on to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot serve two masters. Sound like Hosea? Your alliance was Assyria. All of a sudden you've created another master other than Deuteronomy 6:4. Hosea said, folks, it won't work. And Jesus' profound teaching was, no, it won't work then or now or forever. One master, and that's the master of the God of love. Third illustration is Hosea, really focused in on the definition of power, nationhood, kingship, and the temple. That's real power. But Jesus taught that faithfulness doesn't look like that at all. Faithfulness, he said, is like a mustard seed. Mustard seed that is really teeny tiny, but if nourished, it'll grow. Just like love. Sometimes it's teeny tiny, but if nourished, it's going to grow. And then in the very next sentence, he said, faith is like leaven. Leaven, like yeast, that enables the lump to rise, even though it's almost invisible, just like the presence of love. Now, when you think of Jesus teaching that faith is like a mustard seed, faith is like leaven in the lump, compare that to the establishment's understanding that indeed they expected a Messiah to come riding on a white stallion, and the establishment hoped for the Messiah that indeed would restore the nation, restore kingship, restore the temple. And how did Jesus come? Like a mustard seed, like leaven, riding on an ass into the capital city of Jerusalem. You see how Hosea's understanding of what faithfulness is all about, compared to the establishment, is the same 800 years later in the life of Jesus. But let's leave Jesus' teachings over here for a moment and look at his life. At the end of his life, Jesus did what all of us are asked to do, but seldom can, and that is, he had to practice what he preached. Towards his death, he had the encounter with the Hebrew leadership. And Jesus could have grabbed that power easily, aligned himself with the establishment, and the death on the cross would not have occurred. But he said, no, I've got the power of love in my life. That's all I need, even unto death. And then he was encountered by Pilate. Again, all he had to do was just sort of shake hands with the man, grab the power that would have been his if he would have aligned himself with the Roman Empire. But Jesus didn't do that. When he said, are you the Messiah? And he said, you have said so. I haven't said that. You have said so. He didn't grab that power that Pilate invited him to grab. But he backed away and said, nope, I taught it and I'm going to live it. Love God and love your neighbor. In a very short time, we have sort of taken Hosea's message, see it emerge in the teachings of Jesus, but most of all in his life until his death, to reveal to all of us what faith is all about. It has to do with loving God and loving each other. Now, you talk about discussion possibilities. Let me just lift up 3 possibilities of discussion for us. First of all, let's look at the word love very briefly. Love is not, as used in the scriptures and Jesus used in the Great Commandment, is not an emotional attachment to another person. Agape is an attitude of the mind. It's an attitude, not an emotion. And so when Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor, he was talking about an attitude that I prefer to translate agape as care rather than love. So the great commandment is to have the attitude of care even though you don't like the other person at all. Even though you don't like what is before you, you've got to have the attitude of care, caring for the very best for God and for the very best for neighbor. So for discussion, what are the illustrations in your life that you've observed in others or in your own life of when you really didn't care for the other or care for what was before you? You really didn't love that at all. You didn't have any emotional attachment to it. You said, oh, no. But you still cared, or you observed another person of caring. So what are the stories of faith where we care, have an attitude of care, even though we don't like what we see? Another question I would raise for you is, what are the illustrations and the masters that are contending for us to obey rather than faith? Jesus said you can't have two masters. Where's the competition today? The last question I would ask you just to consider is that so often the church wants to be defined by numbers. How many came? How many were here? How many did it? What's the population? What's the total membership? On and on and on. How does that criteria for measuring the faithfulness of the church stand up against Jesus' teaching that the church might be a mustard seed? The church might be the leaven. Does our criteria of numbers really meet the test of faithfulness? Enjoy your thoughts, and we'll look forward to Sunday.